Hey everybody, welcome to class number 10 of the Watership Down class, that which was originally conceived to be the end of the Watership Down class, but we've added one more week, so we don't quite have to leave Watership Down behind yet. I'm looking forward, however, to finishing the end of Book 4 today. I have some reasonable hope and expectation of actually executing that plan. First, though, some announcements and updates. Firstly, the spring semester classes at Mythgard have started up this week, just yesterday, actually. We had the first, I almost said episode, the first class session of the Beowulf Through Tolkien class by Tom Shippey and Science Fiction 2 with Amy Sturgis. Both classes off to a really great start. So there's still time. The classes are still open for enrollment for the next 2 weeks. We've got a great enrollment this semester, over 100 students enrolled in those two classes this semester. So I strongly recommend that you check them out. These classes this semester are a really great opportunity. We also, of course, had our third annual Myth Moot event this past weekend. Yes, Neil, I did manage to get all of that stuff into my car. I was one of the only of the organizers who drove to the event, and so we had a bunch of leftover stuff, especially food, from our hospitality suite, which all got loaded up into a very ungainly luggage cart for me to take out and squeeze into my small car. And yes, Sarah, I did get Sting home all right, so I got the booze and the weaponry back home across state lines without incident. I'm glad. So anyway, all's well that ends well. And what happens at Myth Moot stays at Myth Moot. But anyway, no, it was a wonderful time. Always a great to see so many of you. I find Myth Moot just this amazing thing where, getting a chance to see, to gather with a big crowd like that. We had almost 120 people total at Myth Moot this year, and just absolutely everybody in the room is somebody that I have known well and interacted with over the span of the last few years in classes like this one, and it's just so wonderful to connect with people. Some people again for the second or third time. Anyway, it was a wonderful time. I also wanted to explain, because I know not everybody was able to be there, and I've just made some sort of cryptic references on Twitter since, while I was there and since I got back, to explain the big announcement that I made on Saturday. That is what my next podcast adventure after Riddles in the Dark is going to be. So let me just sort of explain a little bit of that now, so that people who are following the Mythgard Academy class as well can also understand, and more importantly, in my mind here, not misunderstand what it is exactly that we're planning for the coming year. And as I explained in my tweets, as I explained at Myth Moot, we're going to be kicking off in this spring. Starting in this spring, we're going to be planning a full-length film adaptation of the Silmarillion. And let me do what I did during my talk there, which is to sort of offer some gloss of several of those words. The first is planning. This is the most important thing. We have no plans to put on any kind of production. This is make-believe, which means it's going to be much more fun. We shall plan out and envision an adaptation of the Silmarillion, completely untrammeled by the normal restrictions. Budgets. We don't care about budgets. Availability of talent. We have an infinite resource. We don't have to worry about any kind of pressure from studio executives. We don't have to worry about any kind of pressure from marketing groups or focus groups. We can entirely please ourselves. So that's indeed what we're going to be doing. Dave was joking about this at Mythmood, saying that the need to actually stop talking about what what we believe would be a really awesome Hobbit adaptation, and continue and repeatedly ground ourselves in what we thought likely actually to happen in the film, became more and more wearing, and we've decided just to cut ourselves loose from reality in that way. But of course, the main thing was I found really digging into the Hobbit and the surrounding materials. That is the Appendix A material, the Quest of Erebor stuff, all of these other later writings of Tolkien which bear upon the Hobbit story retroactively from many years later. Digging into that and really thinking through the challenges for adaptation over the course of the Riddles in the Dark series has really, I had so much fun in doing that, and I found that such a fruitful way to really think carefully. There are a whole bunch of things about the Hobbit story that I never really thought about or appreciated until going through in that particular way. So I figured, what could be more fun than that? Well, let's do that with the Silmarillion. Everyone, is always asking the question, hey, are they ever going to do a Silmarillion film? To which my answer is no. So all the bit more reason to talk about it. So we're going to talk about it. The other thing that I would emphasize is the we. We hope that this is going to be a very sort of collective thing. Michael, you're absolutely right. Michael Truskowski asks me, would a TV format be better than a movie format? Absolutely, that's what we're planning. Not a feature film, because that's absurd. We're thinking of a TV series, 1 hour episodes, 12 or 13 episodes per year. That's definitely, that's exactly what we're thinking. No question. Absolutely no desire to squeeze this into any number of feature-length films. In fact, again, that was one of the things that I came away from Riddles in the Dark with, is not just for the Silmarillion, for which that's almost an obvious decision, but in general, I find the idea of anybody trying to do a novel of any length, in a film. They're just not equivalent. I mean, with the scope of the project that you get in a 2 to 3 hour film is about the equivalent in creative scope to like a short story, basically. So you can adapt a short story into a good film. It's really hard to do a novel really well in 2 hours. There's just usually too much to it. Michael asks, the whole thing, or for a particular story? Oh no, Michael, the whole thing. I insist on the whole thing. We're going to start with the Ainulindalë, and we're going to go until we decide to stop. Who knows when that's going to be? The fall of Barad-dûr, possibly. Who knows? But anyway, that's exactly the plan. Whole thing, absolutely. And yes, Gerald, we're going to be formatting it into seasons and episodes, absolutely. So it's one of the things that we're going to be discussing as we go along, thinking about the plot arcs for the individual seasons as well as the individual episodes. My first thought, is I'm thinking season 1, probably Ainulindalë through the chaining of Melkor. Is what I'm toying with right now. We'll have to see. We'll have to kind of plan that out episode by episode and see what happens there. Yes, Karita, we can indeed keep this going for a long time. Dave Kale and I were talking about it on the phone a couple months ago, and I've been sitting on this for a long time, and it's almost killed me. But anyway, so we were talking about this, and we were kind of mocking it out in our heads, how many seasons it would be. And we figure, by the way, it's going to take us at least a calendar year to discuss our way through a full season of this, on average. And we're like, and how many seasons is going to be? And we were like, well, at least 10. I mean, minimum 10 seasons. It's got to be, right? So basically, we figure we're going to be bequeathing this project to our heirs someday. But that's all good fun. So, people are asking, are we going to just stick with the published Silmarillion? No, not necessarily. In fact, I actively have already several elements from the Book of Lost Tales that I would like to put into it. I think we can do some mixing and matching, to try to, that's... In the end, you think of the decisions that Christopher Tolkien had to make when putting together the published Silmarillion, right? Tolkien didn't finish the thing, right? He had to take, all of these writings and the revisions, from his father and decide which ones, right? To put them together into something to present. Well, obviously we will take Christopher Tolkien's choices into account, but we'll make our own choices there too. So anyway, yeah, no, this is going to be awesome. And yes, several of you are talking about like different ideas as far as like casting and costumes, and absolutely. I know nothing about those things. I know nothing about casting. I know nothing about. I'm no good for concept art. I wouldn't be able to design a costume to save my life. We are very much looking forward to the contributions of our friends and listeners on these crucial subjects. Musicians, by the way, we're going to need a score. Anybody who wants to write the score for the music of the Ainur, or I was just reading Baron and Luthien today. Anyone who wants to write both the lyrics and music for the song that Luthien sings before Mandos, start practicing, because we're going to need that. So get on that. Anyway, okay, Karita, I probably could design a costume to save my life, but it would be bad. It would be bad, especially under that kind of pressure. So, anyway, this is going to be terrific fun. We'll, of course, be talking more about this. We're thinking we're probably going to start this up like March-ish. We are going to finish. We have a few things to finish up with the Riddles in the Dark first, and we're looking to. I say probably a couple months before we officially start this up. But we're really excited about it, and I wanted to explain a little bit more. About what it is that we're actually planning to do. So anyway, we're calling it officially the Silmarillion Film Project. So and that's why I've been using the SilmFilm hashtag, which I have to give Rebecca Eagle credit for that one. She came up with that one at Myth Mode, and I thought it was definitely a winner. Yes, Michael, Trish and Dave are going to come back and talk with me, though we plan to have a bunch more regular guests, and we're kind of going to be sort of playing that by ear. I mean, basically, the more people get really involved in this, basically we can see them kind of becoming a part of the process. People who are really pouring a lot of their own creative energy into this, we'll probably want to sort of kind of check in with them and what they're doing pretty regularly. So, we're really sort of open to that. We're not going to give assignments to anybody, but we're very interested to sort of hear from people who are really excited about the idea, really excited about the project. So yeah, we'll be flexible with that. Anyway, I don't want to take all of my time, as tempting as it is to, whenever you start me up on this project, it's tempting to go on to, carry on and talk about it for a long time. But I'm going to stop myself because, by golly, we're going to get through We're going to get to the end of Watership Down today, and finally get to the stuff that I was pretty sure I wasn't going to get to at the end of last time. So there are two things that I want to discuss. About the end of Watership Down. We looked at at Woundwort and the confrontation between Bigwig and Woundwort, which I have always really felt to be really the climax of the story. Now I want to go back and look at two different themes. The first is this theme of natural and unnatural things. Things being natural. This is something we've come back to a lot, right? This was a very forcibly thrust upon us with Cowslip's Warren, right? That's where we see the unnaturalness of those rabbits. But then we were looking at the way in which, in the conversation between Blackberry and Hazel on Watership Down, right after they arrive at the beginning of Book 2, when they talk about stepping out consciously to begin doing things which they would have dismissed as unnatural. The issue in question at that particular moment was bucks digging the warren, right? Bucks digging burrows. And right after that, as you'll recall in that class, we were looking at Hazel's unorthodox idea, which really stretched the kind of worldview of the other rabbits in Watership Down about reaching out to the other kinds of animals on Watership Down in order to get their help. And again, that's not natural. It's not normal. It's not how rabbits generally behave. The main thing I want to come back to here at the end, of course, then we meet Ephrafa, and there's all of this, again, the emphasis on the unnatural life that rabbits lead in Ephrafa. And, of course, with General Woundwort as the sort of centerpiece of the unnaturalness, with the deeply unnatural ferocity, how he's not like a rabbit at all, how he always thinks about fighting first. He never, that fundamental characteristic of rabbits, which has been, we've seen from the very beginning, from the blessing of the bottom of Elacherra, right? Elacherra was given not, teeth and claws with which to destroy his enemies, but he was made the swift runner, and thus enabled to escape from them. And running away, we have seen as, in a sense, almost like the core of rabbitly virtue. Remember, way back at the, I think in the very first class, I was pointing to this as one of those ways in which the story really invites us to leave our human biases aside and kind of enter into that secondary rabbit world, right, in the very beginning. The idea that running away from danger is not cowardly, but actually, in a sense, actually noble. And that first story of the blessing of Elacherra seems to me to kind of suggest that. Certainly gives running away from danger a really good pedigree. So again, Woundwort's complete failure to run away from stuff makes him a deeply unnatural rabbit, and even if he didn't seem to be crazy in other ways, that would be pretty questionable. But what I want to emphasize here at the end of Book 4 is how unnatural the Watership Down rabbits themselves are, right? What we have in this story is not a simple kind of thing, right? It's not just the Watership Down rabbits are perfectly natural, like they are living mainstream, rabbit life, right? And kind of having to walk the middle path between different kinds of extremes, right? Cowslip's Warren with their extreme submissiveness to the men over here, and Ephrafa with its extreme suspicion and sort of military basis over here, right? And then there's the Watership Down being like, the perfect example of normal mainstream rabbitry. It might there are moments when it might sort of seem like that's the overall shape of things, but that's only the shape of things if we don't pay attention to what's going on at Watership Down. Look at Hazel's final plan, right? Not only, of course, is this picking up on the, Hazel's quite unnatural, at least, not normal, at least abnormal idea of, hanging out with other creatures. But look at some of these passages just really jumped out at me this last time reading through. This is Hazel, of course, on the climbing onto the roof of the doghouse at Nottingham Farm. How much noise had he made? How strong was his scent over the tar and straw and farmyard? He waited, tense to jump, expecting movement below. There was no sound. In a terrible miasma of dog smell, which gripped him with fear and called, "Run! Run!" down every nerve, he crept forward to where the eye-bolt was screwed into the roof. His claws scraped slightly, and he stopped again. Still there was no movement. He crouched down and began to nibble and gnaw at the thick cord. What I find really striking about this is the combination of two things, right? On the one hand, the emphasis of what his instincts are telling him, right? The mainstream normal rabbit thing to do is run the heck away from dogs, right? Dogs are extreme. despite what Woundwort says. Dogs are extremely dangerous. Apart from man, they are like the alpha elil that we meet. Due to their size, if nothing else. They're far bigger than any other form of elil that the rabbits come up against. So that's one thing, right? So the mere fact that Hazel is pushing himself to seek out the dog instead of running away from it, right, is already a reversal of his instincts. But this is, to me, made a lot more poignant by the fact that what's happening here is almost normal, or rather has the sort of shadows of normal rabbit behavior. This is a farm raid, right? They're raiding a farmyard. And even that final description, right? He crouched down and began to nibble and gnaw at the thick cord. Going into a dangerous place, mischievously on purpose, in order to crouch down and nibble and gnaw at something you shouldn't be nibbling and gnawing at, well, that's rabbit nature, right? That's totally normal. That's completely natural. That love of mischief, that desire to transgress. And remember, this was we were sort of reminded of this, right? When Hazel and the others are coming into the farmyard and they pass by this pile of vegetables, but they pass it by, right? So here's this golden opportunity for rabbits in a farmyard to eat some fleira and get away with it. And they're like, no, we mustn't focus on the fleira. We must instead go find the dog. I mean, it's just exactly the most unnatural thing that rabbits could be doing under the circumstance. And the fact that it's done in this kind of it's almost like a parody of a garden raid, right? They're going to go in and instead they're just going to set the dog on themselves instead of gnawing the vegetables. Getting the dog set on them is what normally the one thing they're most trying to avoid, right? And yet they've gone here with the express idea of setting the dog on themselves. It's sort of one of those moments where, again, the momentum of the story, it makes perfect sense. We know that Fiverr has received this message from Elohera. We can see what Hazel is doing and why he's doing it, and it's not like we think ill of them, of course, at any moment for this, but just when you back up from it and stop and think about it, you realize these rabbits seem insane, right? They're not, but why not? That's what I want to really kind of put pressure on here, because again, if we just say, well, the Watership Down rabbits are normal and the other rabbits are not, that's not a fit explanation of it. They are at least as abnormal, at least as unnatural as ever Cowslip or General Woundwort was. That's not where the difference lies, right? The difference is not between normality and abnormality. The difference is between flavors of abnormality, right? What kind of abnormality do Hazel and company have that's different from the kind of abnormality that Woundwort and Cowslip have? I'd be really interested to hear what you guys think about that. I'll give one more example and then I'll come back. But I'll be really interested to hear your thoughts about that question. So I'm going to give you some time to type here too. This is Dandelion. He tore over the crest and down toward the cattle shed. When Hazel had told him what he was to do, it had seemed to him that his task would consist of leading the dog on and persuading it to follow him. Now he was running simply to save his life, and that at a speed he had never touched before, a speed he knew he could not keep up. In actual fact, Dandelion covered 300 yards to the cattle shed in a good deal less than half a minute. Okay, confession. How many people calculated his speed? I can never help myself. Depends on how much less than half a minute, of course, he traveled. If he made it the 300 yards to the cattle shed in 25 seconds, he was going about 25 miles an hour or so. But if he did it in closer to 20 seconds, he might have been hitting 30. Rabbit's top speed is normally is reputedly supposed to be about 20 miles an hour. So Dandelion is really hauling tail down the lane here. But as he reached the straw at the entrance, it seemed to him that he had run forever. Hazel and the farmyard were long, long ago. He had never done anything in his life but run in terror down the lane, feeling the dog's breath at his haunches. Inside the gate, a big rat ran across in front of him, and the dog checked at it for a moment. Dandelion gained the nearest shed and went headlong between 2 bales of straw at the foot of a pile. It was a narrow place, and he turned round only with some difficulty. The dog was immediately outside, scratching eagerly, whining and throwing up loose straw as it sniffed along the foot of the bales. "Sit tight," said a young rat from the straw close beside him. "It'll be off in a minute. They're not like cats, you know." "That's the trouble," said Dandelion, panting and rolling the whites of his eyes. "It mustn't lose me, and time's everything." "What?" said the rat, puzzled. "What you say?" Again, the combination of something extremely normal, right? As normal as a garden raid, that is running away from the dog that chases you in the middle of the garden raid, right? Like Rousby Woof in the story. Nothing could be more natural than either of those two things, right? And yet again, we are reminded, especially having that description of his running and the way that sort of his primal fear and instincts take over. He's no longer executing a plan, right? He's just doing what rabbits do, which is running for his life away from the predator. But in the end, he still turns, right? That exchange with the rat, where the rat speaks with him under the absolute and quite natural assumption that Dandelion's desire is to escape the dog, right? But no, Dandelion expresses the reverse of this. It mustn't lose me, and time's everything. And the rat is just completely puzzled by this. Indeed, it's quite a puzzling thing, right? And again, that's my only point. Obviously, I don't intend this as a criticism of the Watership Down rabbits, but again, I think it's easy for us to make assumptions, which I think that we shouldn't make. So let's see. Okay, I'm going back and looking at some of your own thoughts here. Gerald has an interesting observation that I think it would be well for us to take into account as we think this through. Gerald says, "It's interesting that El Herrera often reaches out to other creatures, yet it's not normal for real rabbits." Yes, the resourcefulness of El Herrera, and his. But notice that Hazel has kind of one-upped El Herrera. Of course, the primary story of El Herrera reaching out to other creatures is the trial of El Herrera. You'll recall that that's the context in which the trial of El Herrera story is raised, right? When, back in Book 2 with Hazel's idea, and the rabbits expressing skepticism, and then, that's the story that Bluebell tells, isn't it? Bluebell says, "No, El Herrera did it once." Isn't that Bluebell? Anyway, good. Philip, that's exactly the point I was going to make. El Herrera uses other animals. Hazel communes with them. Yeah, El Herrera bribes them, right? He bribes Yona the Hedgehog, and he bribes, what's his name? Hawkok the Pheasant? Isn't that his name? Yeah, he bribes them, right? He doesn't approach them he doesn't try to befriend them exactly, right? He just kind of pays them off. Hazel seems to have gone even further than El Herrera is doing it. But anyway, nevertheless, Gerald, I want to come back to your observation. You're right that that's not normal for real rabbits, but El Herrera does do it. So that's an interesting thing to keep in mind. Gerald follows that up, asking, "Are the Watership Down rabbits channeling El Herrera better than other rabbits?" Exactly. That's the interesting question to me, right? Is that in fact what we're seeing? El Herrera is tricky. Well, certainly true. But no, I mean, he's an unusual he's an unusual data point, right? I mean, on the one hand, he's the definition of what rabbits are, right? I mean, we've been talking about that throughout the class, that he is the reference point for rabbit culture, but at the same time, he is extraordinary. He's not normal in the sense of being average, right? In the sense of being typical of rabbits. He is an exemplar for rabbits, but that's not the same thing as being like other rabbits, right? So in a sense, becoming extraordinary, that is, there's more about it than just being normal or being average. You can be extraordinary, but extraordinary in that good way, that is becoming more like El Herrera. Arthur couldn't avoid thinking of with the description of Hazel climbing onto the top of the doghouse. He couldn't help but remember Bilbo going down the tunnel to Smaug's lair. I hear you, Arthur. I think that is an interesting parallel. Yeah, good. Kate pointing out how, though Fiver, of course, is the most manifestly abnormal of the Watership Down rabbits, that Hazel is also remarkable in his sensitivity to other creatures, and he also lives longer than normal. Yes, good. Yeah. Carita makes a really cool observation, as she's so wont to do. She says their very reasonable fear, both of Hazel and of Dandelion in these descriptions, the reasonable fear of the dog is far different from the battle cry of dogs aren't dangerous. I agree. That seems to be one thing that we can look at, I think, that we can kind of hold to as a fundamental difference between Woundwort's kind of abnormality and their kind of abnormality, right? They have a normal rabbit way of looking at things, right? They are terrified of the dog, but they willingly overcome that terror in order to achieve something else, right? In order to, even sacrifice themselves, as Dandelion and Blackberry, both of them go into the dog expedition there, recognizing there's a really very good chance they're going to be killed. In fact, it's kind of one of the unspoken reasons why there are two of them, right? Why Hazel doesn't just take one with him, so that in case the dog gets one of them, there's still one more of them to, there's still the other to try to lure the dog. So again, it's a full recognition of how dangerous dogs are. Therefore, there's something more like delusion, right? Not the choice to overcome instincts when there is a need, but something more delusional. Now, but we have to put a little asterisk next to the word delusion, right, with Woundwort, because he's kind of right? I mean, he's not simply delusional to say that he can stand up to Elil. He does stand up. He even stands up to the dog successfully, in a sense, or as far as we know. The evidence does suggest that Woundwort was in fact not killed by the dog. If he were killed, his body would still be there, presumably, as we have no reason from what the narrator tells us to believe that the dog killed him and carried off the body, which would be the other explanation. Now, again, not true to say that dogs aren't dangerous. They are, but still, again, you can't just dismiss Woundwort as delusional. But still, Carita, I think that that's an important distinction, right? It's Woundwort has more of a fundamental worldview change, right? He doesn't think or react like other rabbits at all. The Watership Down rabbits, do think and react like other rabbits. It's the choices that they make that are different, right? Whereas, again, similarly, Cowslip and his warren, which I don't want to totally leave out of this conversation, they do, their own sort of reactions to things seem to have atrophied in certain ways, again, in a very different direction from Woundwort's, but again, they don't seem to look at things the same way that the Watership Down rabbits do. It's one of the things, again, that we see with Strawberry when he leaves. His mourning for his mate who's killed, Nildrohain. That already, he has parted ways with the other rabbits of the warren in the snares. Not just when he comes and, enlists with Hazel, but in his uttering of the name of his mate, right? His speaking of the where, answering a where question. That is to say, his refusal just to kind of write off and distance himself from, a sort of a normal reaction to these kinds of circumstances. So Karita, I think that's a really interesting way. I think that's a really interesting way to think about it. Carolyn has a wonderful observation. Carolyn Morehouse, thinking of Hazel in the doghouse, is reminded of the Gom Jabbar in Dune. That is that test of whether you're a beast or whether you're a human. And remember, as Carolyn is reminding me, that test, of course, is a test of how you respond to instinct, right? You feel pain. Do you jerk your hand out, or can you steel yourself not to jerk your hand out of the pain box? How do you can you, through your reason, master your animal reactions to things, right? So Carolyn, if this is his Gom Jabbar, he passes, right? And it shows that. But to say that he's a human, this would be merely an insult, I think, to Hazel. But nevertheless, I think that is an interesting parallel. That certainly does seem to be, with both Dandelion and Hazel, the thing that's happening, right? What they believe, their convictions, their reason, right? The plan is a rational plan. It's the only thing that can be done to save the Warren from the Ephrathans. But doing it involves them in overcoming all of their normal instincts. That is to say, their animal instincts. Good. Tom Hillman makes an excellent point to sort of remind the reminder that, as the book goes on, it's harder to say what is normal. I agree. Even the I mean, in a sense, it's almost. You think about the relationship. Think about the Watership Down Warren, not only in contrast to Cowslip's Warren and Ephrathah, but in comparison to the Sandalford Warren that they left at the beginning, right? And in one sense, you could say that the Sandalford Warren is probably the most normal rabbit culture that we see, in the sense that there's almost nothing extraordinary about it, right? Cowslip's Warren is extraordinarily twisted in one way. Ephrathah is extraordinarily twisted in a different way. The Watership Down Warren, of course, is extraordinary in a different way. But I certainly don't think that it's really safe to say. So, maybe, Tom, you're right. Maybe what we should be doing is sort of leaving the words normal behind. I would want to go back to the vocabulary I started with, which is not normal and abnormal, but natural and unnatural, right? And maybe here, coming back to the points that Karita and Gerald were making earlier on, the question is not about. That is, the distinction is between one of ends and means, right? Are the ends natural or unnatural? And are the means natural or unnatural, right? The ends, the sort of the goals, what Cowslip's Warren and what Ephrathah are doing, their trajectories are towards something deeply unnatural. The Watership Down Warren is embracing something. Ultimately, its goal, its vision, is very natural. Now, they take unorthodox routes to that, right? They do things which would have been considered unnatural. If you'd sat them down at the beginning of the book, right, and described the riding on boats and befriending gulls and deliberately setting a dog on themselves, they would have said that they were going crazy. But nevertheless, their central vision, the central goal, is simply, remember, it's like the vision that, that Bigwig described and Heisenthal embraced in Ephrathah, right? Morning and evening sylphlay every day. You can choose your own mates. it's a fine life on the downs. That's a natural life for rabbits. Yeah. Okay, I wish I could get to all the comments, which I don't think I can. Besides which, I want to make sure we get through all the things I want to get through here. Yeah, good. Josh Evans says the rabbits were able to change and stay true to their rabbit hearts. Yes, it is a question, I think, about changing the means but not the ends. Yeah. Yeah, good. Yeah, interesting. Philip Lord points out that Woundwort seems to pass the Gom-Jabbar test too. But see, Philip, actually, I think that comparison really sort of cements it for me even more. Woundwort, in a sense, isn't passing it, in that he is not overcoming his impulses. He just has no impulse. I mean, he's like... again, thinking of the Gom-Jabbar and the way the Gom-Jabbar works in Dune, with the, putting your hand in the box of pain and not withdrawing it. It's almost instead like he's got no nerve endings in his hand. His is the reaction of one who doesn't feel the pain, rather than one who masters it. And again, this going back to, I think, was it Karita's point about, them not... him not fearing the dog, whereas obviously Dandelion and Hazel do. Yeah. Interesting. Karita's making a distinction between being a hero and being a legend. And we'll come back to that, Karita. We're almost there. But thinking of Woundwort and his legend, thinking about the unnaturalness of the general, I wanted to look at the penultimate General Woundwort passage. "He isn't dead, broke in Groundsel. The others were silent. "He hasn't stopped running," said Groundsel passionately. "Did you see his body? No. Did anyone? No. Nothing could kill him. He made rabbits bigger than they've ever been, braver, more skillful, more cunning. I know we paid for it. Some gave their lives. It was worth it to feel we were Ephrathans. For the first time ever, rabbits didn't go scurrying away. The Elil feared us, and that was on account of Woundwort, him and no one but him. We weren't good enough for the general. Depend upon it, he's gone to start another warren somewhere else, but no Ephrathan officer will ever forget him." "Well, now I'll tell you something," began Silver, but Hazel cut him short. "You mustn't say you weren't good enough," he said. "You did everything for him that rabbits could do, and a great deal more. And what a lot we learned from you. As for Ephrafa, I've heard it's doing well under Campion, even if some things aren't quite the same as they used to be. And listen, by next spring, if I'm right, we shall have too many rabbits here for comfort. I'm going to encourage some of the youngsters to start a new warren between here and Ephrafa, and I think you'll find Campion will be ready to send some of his rabbits to join them. You'd be just the right fellow to start that scheme off." Look at Hazel. Think of how Hazel's leadership has developed. I mean, this is so smooth. What a smooth way to divert the quarrel that was just about to break out, right, between Groundsel and Silver. And notice how he does it without taking any kind of, controversial stand, right? He doesn't come in and comment at all on the topic of the debate, which is the general. Instead, he puts the focus entirely on Groundsel, thus diverting the controversy away from the debate about the general and instead focusing on something to build up Groundsel's own sort of ego. It's an amazingly diplomatic move there by Hazel, just absolutely deft there. I want to say here, it's important for us to remember. Now, Groundsel, you could say that Groundsel is biased. Remember what Silver wanted to point out was Bigwig beat him, right? Woundwort isn't that much of a legend. He lost, right? He didn't go out on top. The general didn't. Bigwig beat Woundwort. And but notice how even Silver later on says, I guess it was just as well that I didn't say that, right? Why? Well, look at what... This is one of the only expressions that we get. Really, I think the only one. The narrator tells us a lot about Woundwort, and it tells us a lot about... the narrator tells us a lot about Woundwort and his relationship to the other officers in Ephrafa. But most of the things we hear from other rabbits are either the unquestioning obedience of the officers or the terror of, like, the does in Ephrafa and Bigwig, in his strain during his subterfuge in Ephrafa. I think it's important that we're given this. It provides us an important piece, I think, in understanding how Woundwort was, what Woundwort was like to the officers, what he was in the mind of the officers. And this already kind of, hagiographical view of Woundwort that we get. He's not exactly sainted yet, but again, this now clearly legendary building up of Woundwort in the memory of Groundsel is an important thing to recall, right? He wasn't merely a crack-brained slave driver. He might have been that, but he was more than that too. And notice what he meant to Groundsel, right? He made rabbits bigger than they've ever been, braver, more skillful, more cunning. And again, it's hard not to look at this and look at the sort of the ends and means questions that we were just looking at before. The Elil feared us. For the first time ever, rabbits didn't go scurrying away. And you look at that, it's like, I can see how that's an enchanting idea, right? But that's an end, which is an unnatural end, right? That's not what rabbits are meant to be like. That's not how the Elaquera stories go. That's never... the chief rabbit is supposed to be Elaquera to his warren. That's not Elaquera. That's never what he did. Yeah. Interesting. Kate Neville has an interesting point here. Kate says, Woundwort was molding the others into his image. Hazel brought out the best in the individual. What a wonderful observation, Kate. You're absolutely right. What Hazel has been great at from the beginning is seeing what each rabbit is good for, even those who would be dismissed as completely worthless. Of course, the poster child for worthless rabbits who have value at Watership Down has been Pipkin all along, right? Runty, timid, nobody in any kind of a traditional rabbit society, right, in the Sandalford Warren, would ever think that Pipkin was good for anything. And yet, he has been valued by Hazel from the very, very beginning. Good, Philip says, and later Hazel with his lame leg. Exactly, the way that Hazel is overlooked by others. But of course, Hazel's own approach has been Hazel's approach has been exactly the opposite of Woundwort's. It has been all about, exactly the opposite of that outlook, which the outlook which led Woundwort and Campion to just dismiss Hazel. So Kate, I love that. I love that observation. Again, it shows, what is, I think, really a fundamental difference between what Woundwort was doing and what Hazel was doing, and even the way in which rabbits are being made greater. Right? Even Groundsel's interesting comment. I know we paid for it. It was worth it to feel we were Ephraphans. I know we paid for it. That is to say, he seems to recognize, I know it's wrong. right? Not just like morally wrong and we were punished by Frith because we were doing something evil. That's not, I think, what he means. Like, it's unsustainable, right? If rabbits are going to be changed that fundamentally, right, that they're going to be made into something fiercer than the Elil, something that just stands up, that stops running. No, oops, goodness, look at that. That was a little rabbit Freudian slip there. That stops running away, I mean, from the Elil, and instead stands up to them. There's that. He's right, I think, to say that there's a price to be paid for that, and the price to be paid was the freedom and the happiness of all the rest of the rabbits in Ephrathah. Right? If rabbits become something fierce, they cease to be rabbits. One of the things that rabbits have is that, that animality that Strawberry described. They are fundamentally communal creatures who stick together with each other, and that's not the way it is at Ephrathah. All the way down to the ritual wounding of all of the rabbits in the warren in order to mark them into their divisions. Yana says that one thing he thinks is interesting is that Woundwort gets defeated without ever knowing who bested him. That is, of course he acknowledges Bigwig, but that, who or what is that that mysterious chief rabbit that is somewhere lurking in the, and without it, he never knows. He never finds out that it was that lame rabbit that he dismissed, right? I too think that that's interesting, Yana. But again, it certainly serves to show how thoroughly outside of Woundwort's worldview that whole idea is. Good. Karita, building on Kate's point, Hazel brings out natural talent that is already present. Woundwort pushed his followers to become more like himself. Notice that both of them create legends, not only of themselves, but of others, right? We were talking about this, right? The legend of Fiver, the legend of Blackberry, the legend of Bigwig. Those, that's, in a sense, Hazel's doing, right? Because he brought out their talents, because he created a culture there on Watership Down in which the unique abilities of each rabbit could be most useful to all, right, and valued differently by everyone. But Woundwort also creates legends. Campion being the number one example, and even some of the officers who have unfortunately died. People, rabbits like Charlock and Mallow, right, who have suffered accidents, which we'll get back around to, but still they were legendary rabbits in their own time. But again, Karita, as you say, in Woundwort's mold, right? Not on their own. Now, Campion, of course, is the one who's kind of an exception there, right? In that he is, he's least exactly like Woundwort of the others, right? You've got Vervain, who's sort of Woundwort's mini-me, right? And then you've got, just as cruel, just as heartless, just as fierce, except for when confronted by small prophetic rabbits. But anyway, I mean, Campion is different, right? Campion stands out in the Ephrathah Ausla. Even Woundwort respects Campion, as if recognizing that Campion is not merely a copy of himself. Interesting. Philip sees a parallel between Campion and Holly. Both disagreed with their leaders, but still followed them. I think that's interesting. Yana, I was speaking to you, not about the hedgehog. I know that must be surreal. I could try to inflect it a little bit differently, but anyway. But Karita, I agree. I too like it that Woundwort died fighting and wasn't driven out in humiliation. Yes, I agree. I think that's a fascinating, and this passage is one of the ones that I think, to me, really drives home the importance of that. That Woundwort too is a legend. I can't help but remember Sam's comment in the famous discussion with Frodo about stories on the stairs of Cirith Ungol, where he says that even Gollum might be good in a story, better at least than he is to have by you, right? And Woundwort too is better in a story than he was to have by you. Yeah, good. Yeah. Okay, sorry. Arthur is chiding me for making a Tolkien reference. Yes, Arthur, I was totally unprovoked to make that reference. I couldn't help it. Yeah, good. Well, we're already talking about legends and heroes. Let's go on and look at this. Notice the process. We've already seen some of it. Remember that moment? We talked about this a little bit in the moment when Hazel returns to the Warren after being shot. And there's the sense that all the rabbits in the Warren have there at the end of book 2, that something momentous, like this sort of spiritual change has come upon them. It's not just like, wow, well, man, Hazel's an awesome resource for this Warren, and having lost that resource, we would have been in trouble. There was something much more nebulous to it than that, right? There was this mythic significance of the return of Hazel to the Warren, even at the time, right? Even to those rabbits who were there at the time. We see a similar kind of growth of legend here. I've always loved this moment. At that moment, General Woundwort, out in the open grass below the bank, was facing Thistle and Ragwort in the checkered yellow moonlight of the small hours. "You weren't put at the mouth of that run to listen," he said. "You were put there to stop anyone breaking out. You had no business to leave it. Get back at once." This is, of course, after Fiver has just barked underground. "I give you my word, sir," said Thistle querulously. "There's some animal down there that is not a rabbit. We both heard it." "And did you smell it?" said Woundwort. "No, sir. No tracks or droppings either, but we both heard an animal, and it was no rabbit." Several of the diggers had left their work and were gathered nearby, listening. A muttering began. "They had a homba that killed Captain Mallow. My brother was there. He saw it. They had a great bird that turned into a shaft of lightning. There was another animal that took them away down the river. Why can't we go home?" The legend of Watership Down grows among the rabbits of Ephrafa. Notice the progression there, right? How each one of those things is tied to something that happened, right? But of course is not either a misunderstanding of what happened or already an escalation into myth, right? Yes, a humba killed Captain Mallow. Boy, is it hard. I mean, that's a hard one to resist, right? Of course, the Watership Down rabbits didn't actually sick the humba on Captain Mallow, but boy, is that a hard concept to resist, right? It sure looks like it in retrospect when you know that Bigwig was working with them, and the way that all fell out. The idea that there was some strange animal that took them away down the river, a very natural conclusion by rabbits who, by and large, don't understand, the boat any more than any of the other Watership Down rabbits did, other than Blackberry and Fiver. And then, of course, the bird turning into a shaft of lightning. Again, one can understand where that comes from. We see this legend growing, the sort of the mythic stature that this very strange and unnatural Warren is developing in their minds. And then, of course, we get the passage which many of you have been referring to in your comments, and which, of course, I've been building up to. And that is the overheard story that Vilthoril is telling her litter. "So after they had swum the river," said Vilthoril, "Elachera led his people on in the dark through a wild, lonely place. Some of them were afraid, but he knew the way, and in the morning brought them safely to some green fields, very beautiful, with good sweet grass. And here they found a warren that was bewitched. All the rabbits in this warren were in the power of a wicked spell. They wore shining collars round their necks, and sang like birds, and some of them could fly. But for all they looked so fine, their hearts were dark and tharn. So then Elahera's people said, "Ah, see, these are the wonderful rabbits of Prince Rainbow. They are like princes themselves. We will live with them and become princes too." Vilthero looked up and saw the newcomers. She paused for a moment, and then went on. But Frith came to Rabscuttle in a dream, and warned him that the warren was enchanted, and he dug into the ground to find where the spell was buried. Deep he dug, and hard was the search, but at last he found that wicked spell, and dragged it out. So they all fled from it, but it turned into a great rat, and flew at Elahera. Then Elahera fought the rat up and down, and at last he held it, pinned under his claws, and it turned into a great white bird, which spoke to him and blessed him. "I seem to know this story," whispered Hazel, "but I can't remember where I've heard it." Nancy says she's not sure how she feels about Fiver as Rabscuttle. Under the circumstances, I love Fiver as Rabscuttle. And by this, first of all, when you think about it from one perspective, it makes perfect sense, right? If Hazel is Elahera, well, Rabscuttle is his lifelong companion who always shares a burrow with him, right? So Fiver is, in one sense, in the Rabscuttle position. Now, needless to say, the relationship between Hazel and Fiver is far from a perfect parallel to the relationship between Elahera and Rabscuttle. But the other thing, Nancy, that I love about the circumstances here is who's telling the story, right? It's Viltheril, Fiver's mate, who's telling the story. So, casting her buck into the role of Rabscuttle, it's hard not to like that. I have to admit, I find it adorable. But anyway, okay. So what do we do with this? What do we make of this? I mean, on the one hand, not thinking anything of any sort of other larger implications of this, I find this retelling of the story fascinating. I find that it sheds a really interesting light on the other story that we already did read, right? The way that this is being characterized, in particular, of course, the business about the Warren of the Snares, that image of them wearing shining collars around their necks, the true sort of the historical significance of the Warren of the Snares with, the snares, is lost. But it's there, right? It's still symbolically implied in the fact that they're all collared like domesticated beasts, but shining collars to suggest the snares. And then that image again, which not just the casting of him as Rabscuttle, but you can tell that there's a kind of a Fiverocentric angle on this story from his doe Viltheril. Because of the nature of the description, like the description of the drama. He dug into the ground to find where the spell was buried. Deep he dug, and hard was the search, but at last he found that wicked spell and dragged it out. Thinking back to Fiver's own imagery of like trying to bite the bark and figure out what it was, it sounds very, this sounds sounds very much like a mythic version of this story, which has been adapted from Fiver's version of the story, right? That he told and what he emphasized. Now, what do we do here? First of all, one other image that several of you are talking about is the transformation of the rat into the white bird. Josh Evans says that he really likes the fact that the evil is transformed into a blessing in that way, and it does seem, doesn't it, Josh, like a really cool sort of nod to the way in which the evil things that befall them, the challenges which they face, are the things which, through their handling of those situations, their response to those situations, have been transformed into blessings, right? Kind of like the blessing of El Herrera's bottom at the beginning. And Michael Jeffskoski says the rat turning into a white bird and blessing him reminds him of Jacob wrestling with the angel. Yeah, I can see that. And Hazel even limped afterwards. I'd have to think about it more. But, Jacob is clearly the most El Herrera-like of the patriarchs, isn't he? You totally see the whole business with the striped and ring-streaked rams is totally something that El Herrera would have done. If you're unfamiliar with the story, don't worry about it too much. But anyway, yeah, good, interesting. Thomas Johnson points out that he says that he likes the oblique reference to silverweed. In some of them could fly. Silverweed certainly wanted to, Thomas says, as he says in the poem. Yeah, I agree. That is an interesting kind of literalization of that. That is, the sort of, it's being made literally true in symbol. Yeah. But what do we do with this incident in the larger scope of things, right? Or rather, to say it a different way, how does this incident, that is the overhearing of Vilthoril's story, inform our understanding of the legends that are emerging? Now, it's pretty clear that we have heard this story before, though not exactly like that, right? What's happening here? Karita asks the excellent question, does she know the real story and is retelling it in hero mode? How are we supposed to be understanding this? Is this Vilthoril deliberately inventing an El Herrera story, consciously inventing an El Herrera story modeled on the story of Watership Down? It seems like it. I mean, it's hard for me to see any other explanation of it. I don't think that this is confusion. I don't think this is ignorance. Ignorance of all of the truth, and her, sort of putting together this story. I don't think it's coincidence. So yes, I think. Remember, this is happening. Some time has already passed. There's no reason to think that Vilthoril doesn't know the whole story. She's got to know. That I can't see any really convincing reading that doesn't involve Vilthoril being quite conscious about what she's doing. So the question is, as several of you are asking, what does this suggest about the other El Herrera stories, right? Is this, as Nick Marazzo says, is this the way that the legends of El Herrera are formed? That in a sense he is the chief rabbit of every warren. We've seen that, a chief rabbit should be El Herrera to his people. Is El Herrera just, in fact, in that sense, merely this sort of crystallization of all of the great chief rabbits that ever have been, right? Does it actually work the other direction? Is El Herrera not merely a mythic figure in sort of the greater Lewis and Tolkien sense of the word myth, but is he a mythic figure in the much flatter modern sense of that word, right? In the sense that there is no El Herrera, he's just a story, which was inspired by real events and made sort of bigger. That certainly seems to be a way to read this, right? That soon the story of Hazel and the Watership Down Warren is going to become an El Herrera story, right? It's happening here before our eyes. so that's it, right? But of course, the corollary of that is, well, there is no such thing as El Herrera, right? The stories are all just stories that emerged like this, from real rabbits who do extraordinary things, and then their story is made into legend and becomes an example, and again is sort of branded an El Herrera story. Look at another example here. General Woundwort was never seen again, but it was certainly true, as Groundsel said, that no one ever found his body. So it may perhaps be that, after all, that extraordinary rabbit really did wander away to live his fierce life somewhere else, and to defy the Ilil as resourcefully as ever. Kehar, who was once asked if he would look out for him in his flights over the downs, merely replied, "That damn rabbit! I no see him! I no want I see him!" Before many months had passed, no one on Watership knew or particularly cared to know whether he himself or his mate was descended from one or two Efferfin parents, or from none at all. Hazel was glad that it should be so. And yet there endured the legend that somewhere out over the down there lived a great and solitary rabbit, a giant, who drove the Elul like mice, and sometimes went to Silflay in the sky. If ever great danger arose, he would come back to fight for those who honored his name, and mother rabbits would tell their kittens that if they did not do as they were told, the general would get them. The general who was first cousin to the black rabbit himself. Such was Woundwort's monument, and perhaps it would not have displeased him. Gerald says, the successful rabbits live on as El Herrera stories. The unsuccessful rabbits, well, as they're cousin to the black rabbit, right? He becomes. Notice the mixture, though, which I find really interesting here in the legend of General Woundwort. That on the one hand, he's like not the boogeyman, the boogie rabbit, right? He's that that disciplinary figure who will come out to get bad rabbits. He's what mother rabbits scare their kittens with, but at the same time, he's also like, some kind of lapine King Arthur, right? Who, if ever, the land is in great need, shall return. That's an interesting contrast between those two, right? And yet, both of them are said to be true of him. One last quick point here. One of the words that jumps out at me here, thinking back to our conversation about natural and unnatural, solitary, a great and solitary rabbit, right? Even in this sort of his legendary being, he's conceived of as being solitary, that is deviant, in a sense, from normal rabbits. It's not like he's the head of this great rabbit counterculture, and somewhere has raised up this new warren of rabbits who chase the Ela like mice. He lives alone. And that seems, again, to be communicating something essential about the difference between his unnaturalness and the unnaturalness of the Watership Down rabbits. Tom says, so now we know where he went. Avalon, right, exactly. Yeah, you can find General Woundwort in Avalon, doubtless, hanging out, with King Arthur and Ransom and other people. Yeah. Yeah, interesting. Nancy Fosberg suggests that that the mixture, the sort of the he shall be the savior who shall return, and he shall be the monster who will punish children, seems perhaps to come from the mixing of the two cultures. Rabbits like Groundsel would, of course, tell the King Arthur style stories. Nancy, I think that's an excellent point. It's an excellent point. Okay. But again, notice, so here Woundwort has gone into legend, right? And is first cousin to the Black Rabbit himself. Does that mean that the Black Rabbit is similarly legendary in this sense, right? In the sense of just a story, just a legendary concept, just a mythic idea extracted from the extraordinary but mundane stories of actual rabbits, right? Well, then we get that business at the end, right? This rabbit comes to visit the aged Hazel in his burrow. Yes, of course, said Hazel, hoping he would be able to remember his name in a moment. Then he saw that in the darkness of the burrow the stranger's ears were shining with a faint silver light. Yes, my lord, he said. Yes, I know you. You've been feeling tired, said the stranger, but I can do something about that. I've come to ask whether you'd care to join my Ausla. We shall be glad to have you, and you'll enjoy it. If you're ready, we might go along now. They went out past the young sentry, who paid the visitor no attention. The sun was shining, and in spite of the cold, there were a few bucks and does at Silfley, keeping out of the wind as they nibbled the shoots of spring grass. It seemed to Hazel that he would not be needing his body any more, so he left it lying on the edge of the ditch, but stopped for a moment to watch his rabbits and try to get used to the extraordinary feeling that strength and speed were flowing inexhaustibly out of him and into their sleek young bodies and healthy senses. You needn't worry about them, said his companion. They'll be all right, and thousands like them. If you'll come along, I'll show you what I mean. He reached the top of the bank in a single powerful leap. Hazel followed, and together they slipped away, running easily down through the wood, where the first primroses were beginning to bloom. Which, of course, closes the loop. If you're just reading this book for the first time, you may not remember that the first sentence of the book in chapter 1 is the primroses were over. So we have the end of the season of primroses, and the primroses just beginning to bloom at the end, which, and sort of that cyclical effect of the story here is certainly appropriate to the final themes here of this passage. So what do we do with this? What do we do with this? Does this really happen? Is this metaphor? I've been admitting all the way along that I am inclined to believe, my reading of this story is that there are actively supernatural, spiritual forces at work here. We started talking about this more when we were looking at the incident of the train, right, and the whole fiery messenger of Frith thing. Because, as you'll recall, that's a situation which really kind of challenges, really sort of prompts this question, right? We're given a kind of interpretive choice in that scene because we know what really happened, right? What really happened was a train came by and ran over Captain Charlock. It wasn't a messenger from Frith, it was just a train, right? It was just like the 507 out of Epping or whatever it was, right? And not only is it not, this unpredictable and shocking event out of the blue, it was probably running right on its timetable, right? Again, that's one choice that we can make in response to that scene. The other is to see the thing from Holly's point of view, right? And I think that the fact that we know that it was actually, the 507 train out of Epping or whatever, it's not, that doesn't undermine the more mythic understanding. Again, I'm going over old material here, and I think that we can see that kind of, I've been talking about the conspiracy, right? The sort of the great conspiracy of events, which leads to the frankly improbable, in several ways, improbable success of all of the plans of the rabbits of Watership Down, and ultimately the failure of General Woundwort, who would really seem to have most of the advantages in that particular conflict. Again, here, we're presented with the same choice, right? We know what really happened here, right? Hazel died of old age. As Yana, as you were pointing out, notice how Hazel leaves his body under the bank, right? He goes out and dies outside. We're told earlier, rabbits very rarely die underground, right? They tend to sneak off and die alone when they know that it's their time to die. So, Nancy says what she does with this passage is cry on the bus. Yes, and Arthur was just saying the same thing. The first thing we do with this passage is cry. Yes, I agree. I find this a very moving passage. So again, we know what really happened here, right? Hazel went out and died of old age. That's what really happened. But again, here, much more forcibly than in the train passage, the other side, or rather the sort of rabbit spirituality reading, is superimposed upon that naturalistic phenomenon much more fully, right? We may feel like we have to make a choice earlier on between, do we see this as just a train and probably a coincidence, or do we see this as a fiery messenger of Frith? Again, we can kind of embrace both, but again, it's sort of, is this a supernatural event or is this a natural event, right? And the train, at the very least, it's easier just to choose one path or the other there. Here, I think much less so, much less easy to just choose the paths. Instead, it seems to be much more clearly a glimpse behind the curtain, right? Yes, Hazel is dying of old age. Here's what a rabbit, especially a rabbit hero like Hazel, dying of old age actually looks like. I, in this sense, find the intervention of El Herrera at the end, I'm inclined to take that quite literally, especially going back to all the Fiver stuff, right? And what has been revealed to us through Fiver's prophetic visions, really Fiver's whole prophetic career, that sense of that other place, right? That El Herrera can go back and forth between them at will, as Fiver's kind of heard is the case. This is, all of, the way in which at times those others, can cross over, and you've got poor rabbits like Silverweed who are, in one sense, kind of living in both places and being drawn out of the mundane world and further into the spiritual world. Ultimately, Fiver says to his sort of inevitable death, Fiver too, having not fully returned, to our world from that other place after his final vision. Hazel is now, upon his death, being accepted, into that other world, and being invited to join El Herrera's Ausla. And again, what a wonderful thing. This is like in that sense, I love the way in which that action is like the final crowning commendation on Hazel and his whole approach, right? Not only, the mere fact, of course, that he's being invited to be a member of El Herrera's Ausla, right, sort of shows El Herrera's endorsement of him. But it's not just that. It's that the invitation of Hazel into the Ausla is itself an exactly Hazel-like move, right? Only Hazel would have looked at this, resourceful, courageous, level-headed, limping, not enormously physically imposing rabbit and say, oh yeah, Ausla material, right? El Herrera appreciates him for what he is, and it's clear that there is a spot in El Herrera's Ausla for rabbits like Hazel, and not just rabbits like Bigwig. I'm assuming Bigwig's going to make El Herrera's Ausla too. Anyway, yeah, Mark Willie says, with this ending I have such a mixed emotional reaction. Never have I felt such a poignant sense of loss, while at the same time feeling a great sense of happiness for Hazel going on into the afterlife. I find it... in many ways I find, there's the sense of loss, but I think that the passage really kind of tries to mitigate that in a sense, not only through the reassurances, that they'll be all right and thousands like them, but that description of that extraordinary feeling that Hazel has of strength and speed flowing inexhaustibly out of him and into their sleek young bodies and healthy senses. That in a sense, he isn't being lost, right? It's easy to imagine, the lament and the mourning for Hazel, the by this time, great and legendary Chief Rabbit, and yet he's not lost truly. Anyway, yeah, and as Patrick points out, there's no pain, there's no suffering. He just leaves his body behind. Yeah. In the end, now going back to Vilthoril's Elaquera story, does the composition of Vilthoril's Elaquera story suggest that there is no real Elaquera, right? That the stories of Elaquera are a mere sort of legendary composite of, based on the adventures of real life chief rabbits that have ascended into this sort of mythic and legendary stature. Well, no. There appears to be an Elaquera who is inviting Hazel to join his Ausla. Rather, it seems to work in the other way, right? Just as Hazel's strength and speed are flowing out of him and into the other rabbits, so Elaquera's attributes, the gifts of Elaquera, have been flowing into Hazel all along. That story that Vilthoril's telling, is that the story of Hazel and Fiver, or is it the story? Is it an Elaquera story, the story of Elaquera and Rabscuttle? It's both, in a sense. There's a sense in which these distinctions, the distinctions between the naturalistic explanation, is it just a train, and the broader spiritual explanation, is it a messenger of Elaquera, where the distinction between them really ceases to matter at all, and seems to begin to sound like a bit of a silly question. And that seems to me where the story kind of leaves us, with this question of their legends. In the end, it's rabbit mythology, and rabbit mythology seems to be shock of shocks, based fundamentally on this really intimate sense of community, this sense of oneness among rabbits, right? And so, yes, were those Hazel's adventures? Yes, they were. Were those the adventures of Elaquera? Well, yes, in a sense, they were. Yeah. Interesting. Nick Marazzo says, the narrator gives us the death of Hazel in his own perspective, saying, that is, in the narrator's own perspective, saying, I cannot tell how many springs later, but includes Hazel's thoughts, words, and perspective. I've always thought this to be a true ending from Hazel's perspective, but discovering the narrator's personalization, it does introduce doubt. It ultimately comes down to whether you choose to believe in the Black Rabbit or not. I mean, again, you can distance yourself from it, but I find myself resisting that distancing. And to me, it seems like sort of at the end of the story, we're being invited to make that last step into that secondary rabbit world, right? That last step, the step that Hazel is making from this one world, the natural, mundane world around us, into that wider, other wild world that Fiver was occasionally in touch with, or was occasionally in touch with him, and into which Hazel is sort of transitioning here at the end. And again, we can choose to resist that, but I think that if we do, again, it's just us pulling back and thinking, and sort of thinking from a human point of view instead of from the rabbit point of view. It is definitely my reading that the story is inviting us to make that transition along with them. I still have a little bit of time to talk about questions and things. Let me quickly bring up two other small notes. One, I want to pick up on a question that we talked about a long time ago, which is the epigraphs at the beginning of the chapters. Nancy, I think it's you who was talking about the Blake one, right? Looking at sort of the relationships between those, sort of figuring out how those worked. I wanted to just share my very favorite chapter epigraph in the entire book. The epigraph of the last chapter. Not the epilogue, the final chapter. Professing myself, moreover, convinced that the general's unjust interference, so far from being really injurious to their felicity, was perhaps rather conducive to it, by improving their knowledge of each other, and adding strength to their attachment, I leave it to be settled by whomever it may concern. He doesn't even finish that one sentence by Austen. I absolutely love this epigraph, and the relevance of this epigraph to the story is obvious, right? Especially with the general's unjust interference and the two Warrens being brought closer together, so far from it's being really injurious to their felicity, was perhaps rather conducive to it. The way that it works with this story is absolute genius, and it's like 10 times more wonderful if you know the story that it's coming from, if you know Austen's Northanger Abbey. Yes, it is, as Carita and Nancy are both saying, it is this is a quotation which is being taken wildly out of context and planted into a new place. And it's fantastic. It's just absolutely, it's so brilliant the way that he's done that. And to me, this is why, this is the one I was thinking of. The question, and I forget who exactly was asking it, but the question that I shall use the evasive passive that I was being asked before, was about the relationship. I know, Nancy, I remember you about the Blake one. Well, maybe it was in the context of your email, Nancy, so I'll give you credit for it. About sort of what is the relationship between these epigraphs and the chapters, especially since we spent so much time in the Dune class just before looking at the relationship between the Princess Irulan quotations at the beginning of the chapters and the story itself. It's this to me is Nancy, way back then, that this is the answer that I wanted to give. This passage is the example I wanted to give. I think that most of the time the epigraphs seem to work like this. That is, the actual quotation, like the content of the lines there on the page, are relevant, often very cleverly relevant. Possibly my second favorite, I think probably my second favorite one is the quotation from the Book of Acts, in the crossing of the River Enborn, and thus some on boards and some on broken pieces of the ship, they all arrived safe to land. Again, like, it's about the shipwreck of the Apostle Paul, who's being taken a prisoner to Rome. So it's completely irrelevant, apart from the fact that one quotation taken out of context is marvelously relevant to the events of that chapter. That is to say, it seems to function more like a kind of joke. But even that joke, of course, the general and the general and his unjust interference. Of course, he's quite different from General Woundwort, and the circumstances are rather not the same. This is referring to the guardian of one of the young lovers in question in Northanger Abbey. Yeah. But I think that there is nevertheless an overall trend. That is, when I say that they work almost like jokes, it's not that I think that they're merely throwaways, right? That it's simply comedy, or that it's merely comical. One of the overall trends that I would suggest. Again, the fact that you have to many, not all, but somewhere between many and most of the passages, you have to take them out of context for them to be directly relevant to the passage that to the chapter that follows. Suggests to me a really interesting kind of shift of perspective, right? It shows a kind of connection between the story that you're reading, the rabbit story, and these other stories that are being quoted and alluded from. You've got to sort of shift your perspective in order for those quotations to make sense. Again, to me, it's almost like it's parallel to the way in which throughout the story we are being invited to shift our perspective and look at things not from a human point of view, but from a rabbit point of view. And so we get this kind of reinvention of these stories through their placement in these chapters. One other point that I wanted to make, and this was something that Ed Powell and I were talking about right before the class started, and Ed pointed this out to me. Dr. Adams arrived soon after 10. Lucy, who was making her bed and tidying her room later than she should have been, heard him stop his car under the elms at the top of the lane and went out to meet him, wondering why he had not driven up to the house as usual. And Jana had asked, is Dr. Adams based on Richard Adams? And more importantly, is this based on something that really happened to him? No and yes. Ed and I had this conversation at the beginning of the semester where he sent me this email and was like, holy crap, I can't believe I've read this book, I don't know how many dozens of times over my life, and I totally missed the Dr. Adams point. And I have to admit, when he said that, my very first reaction was, what Dr. Adams point? I barely even noticed this reference ever. I don't think it ever struck me as significant once in my life that in this one little reference the doctor is called Dr. Adams. I think perhaps because he is most commonly referred to by Lucy merely as Doctor, like Lucy and her dad just call him Doctor. So that's how I always thought of him. But holy cow, and it turns out, yes, actually this is relevant. It's not Richard Adams himself, but seems quite transparently based on Richard Adams's dad. Richard Adams's father was in fact a country physician who drove around and did house calls in this region, and in fact Richard Adams tells stories of himself as a child traveling around with his dad in his car and going with him on his rounds right here in this exact area around Watership Down. This is based on something that really happened to him, and imagining that connection with Richard Adams's father there, with the benevolent Dr. Adams that we meet there at the end, is a lovely kind of thing. Jana had several points. One other that I'll quote here. He makes an interesting observation and then asks a fascinating question. Worst of them all, Rousby Woof, is the great rat spirit, the giant of Sumatra, the curse of Hamelin. I love the reference to Hamelin, Jana says, and logically it's famous rat catcher. The real question is, how would rabbits know about it, and what would the Lapine version sound like? Of course, the famous rat catcher of Hamelin, in case you don't remember, is the Pied Piper. This is the Pied Piper of Hamelin is who we're referring to here. And Jana's question is an excellent one. How do the rabbits know the story of the Pied Piper of Hamelin? There has to be it can't be a coincidence that the great rat spirit is associated specifically with Hamelin, right? How did they learn? As Michael Tchaikovsky says, the same way they know about camels, right? Yeah. I don't know. I don't know. Long grass rumors. There does seem to be some kind of transmission here. I don't know whether this is supposed to be I don't know whether this is supposed to be natural or supernatural. Again, in as much as we're supposed to invest in this at all, I mean, I don't know that we need build a whole philosophy and theology upon this one reference to the curse of Hamelin. But two things that I can't help but recall from the story earlier on. One is that almost all animals seem to be able to converse with each other. That is, like we see, for instance, on two different occasions, Hazel and a cat communicating with each other. Could a domesticated animal have heard this story from humans and circulated among the animal kingdom? That seems conceivable. The other thing that I can't help but think of is Fiver's dream, where he was talking to the man by the message board, and you remember that the man in his dream was revealing to him things which men know, but which Fiver couldn't possibly know under any other circumstance. A human thing, which Fiver could not possibly have any sort of naturalistic access, and yet he heard it. He knew it in this dream. To me, it seems. I'm actually even more, Jan, I'm even more interested in your second question. What would the Lapine version sound like? Or to lean on that a little bit more. The context in which the Pied Piper is alluded to within the Rousby Wolf story, right? Worst of all, Rousby Wolf is the great rat spirit, the giant of Sumatra, the curse of Hamelin. The giant rat spirit who was, the champion or moving force behind the rat invasion of Hamelin, which was cured by the Pied Piper. But of course, there's no reference to the Piper himself, just to the rats, and it's done in the context, of course, of Rousby Wolf being such a great ratter, right? Such a valiant foe of this enemy of dogs, who are rats. So that kind of puts Rousby Wolf parallel with the Pied Piper, right? Obviously, their approaches are pretty different, but thinking about the depiction of, Rousby Wolf in this story and the sort of scorn in which he is held, it's hardly a flattering. Just gives a very flattering impression of the Pied Piper story. One is tempted to say, Jana, that the Lapine version of the story would be very different. And excellent, Thomas, thank you for the reminder there. We've seen rabbit repurposing of human tales before. There's apparently a rabbit version of the Noah story. Remember the story about the great flood, when Frith flooded the world, and but a man built a giant hutch. Remember that? Absolutely. Good. Very good. Yeah. Yep. No, we've seen that. We've seen that before. Anyway, two more issues. Well, okay, three more issues. Almost done. 2 points on Dea Ex Machina at the end of the story. In an article found on the Mythgard Academy page, Adams claims that he does not write people well, and after reading chapter 48, Dea Ex Machina, I would have to respectfully disagree. In this brief chapter, we learn much about Lucy, who is perhaps the Dea of the machine, her father, who is hard but fair, and the good doctor, who hides behind a hard exterior. In a few short pages, we get a clear picture of life on this farm, the rhythms of the day, and the language spoken. language spoken, I would emphasize as well. As I've said many times, Adams has such a good ear and such a brilliant, and what's not the same thing, such a brilliant knack for capturing the sound of dialectical speech and of animal noises in phonetic form. That is not easy to do. But anyway, the chapter seems to resonate on many different levels. It left me wondering what Hazel must have been thinking after the rescue from the cat. How did he feel when he was carried around by Lucy? And how did he feel when he was put inside the drawer? And what about the ride in the hoodoo? It does not seem as if Hazel was Tharn, as he recovers from the experience quickly and is rather nonchalant about his most extraordinary afternoon. I found Dea Ex Machina to be an extraordinary chapter within an extraordinary novel, and I wondered what you and other classmates thought. That I think is a really neat point. It's certainly true. I mean, to me, the fascinating thing about this chapter is that complete perspective shift. Because you're right, if the narrative followed Hazel, that chapter would be completely different, right? I mean, because you're right, when you construct this one chapter in the book forcibly realigns our point of view for the first time now, having thoroughly immersed us in the Lapine perspective all the way through, seeing these things, seeing the whole world afresh, even very familiar things like clouds moving in the sky, from a Lapine point of view, and thinking of them as a rabbit would think of them. Now suddenly, the perspective shifts for this one chapter back to a normal human perspective, to the way we're used to looking at things. And we are given Hazel, our protagonist of the story, in the moment of his great bravery and self-sacrifice and ingenuity and heroism, and we are sort of invited to look at him from the human perspective, not even as Woundwort looked at him, right? The limping rabbit, but as the humans look at him, I mean, in one sense, I think it does. For me, it really emphasizes what an amazing job the rest of the book does in bringing us into the rabbit point of view. How sort of stark is this shift in perspective? But you're right, Josh, that we have to kind of supply our own narrative version, right? And with the experience that we've gotten over the course of the book, we can only imagine. But we can, I think, imagine pretty powerfully what Hazel's point of view would be like, to be trapped there by the cat and then suddenly picked up by a human, right? To be picked up by this girl and carried in and put in a drawer, and then driven in a hoodoo. I mean, what he must have imagined was happening to him when he was carried off in the hoodoo, right? And then suddenly to find himself at the foot of Watership Down, released at the foot of Watership Down. And again, as you say, we get almost nothing from that, right? We don't have, he does not come up the hill with wide eyes, being like, I was just delivered by, a messenger of Frith. It's amazing. Philip Lord, of course, is pointing to the intriguing similarity that, of course, Hazel and Woundwort were both rescued by humans. It is this other kind of touchstone between the two of them. But thinking more about the Ex Machina part, here's Tom's thoughts on this. He says, I intended to write a different email than you are about to read, but as I began to lay things out, my mind changed. I had meant to write about how there seemed to be an inordinate number of timely and improbable external interventions that save the day when all seems lost. I saw this as a bit of a flaw. The last one, the little girl, just seemed like one Deus Ex Machina too many. Then I noticed what might be a progressive pattern. We have the train, Machina Ex Machina, the fox that kills Campion, Volpes Ex Machina, the dog that kills Woundwort, Canis Ex Machina, and the little girl, Puella Parva Ex Machina.
That does seem rather a lot, but with each intervention we move closer to the human. Machine, wild animal, tame animal, child. In the first, moreover, the machine, which is of course made by humans, is taken by the rabbits to be a messenger from God. And humans are of course the greatest of Elil, who kill, destroy, and oppress. They gas and bulldoze Sandalford, they reduce Cowslip's warren to a rabbit farm, they imprison the hutch rabbits, they shoot Hazel. There is paradox and irony in Hazel's being saved at the end by a human, especially since it was Fiver's premonition of the coming destruction of Sandalford that sent Hazel and the rest on their journey. So why is Hazel saved by the compassion of the greatest of Elil? Is it because Hazel has shown compassion throughout? Towards one rabbit after another, yes, but perhaps more importantly, towards other creatures, like Kehar and the mouse? Is it also because he has shown himself willing to sacrifice himself for others? You could say his compassion rules the fate of many. To which, Tom, I would add, his own not the least. Yes. Good. Now, two criticisms that I would make here, Tom. First is it's not like Volpe's ex machina, right? It's more like Deus ex Volpem, right? I mean, it's not the machines. It's the fox is the machine, not the Deus. But secondly, I'm not sure the progression is cool. I'm not sure the progression totally works. That is, I mean, the criticism that I would make of the argument there is that there's like a little bit of cherry picking going on, right? I mean, there's more that I would point to as other examples of this kind of thing. The boat, for instance, right? So it doesn't exactly it's not exactly like a linear progression in that way. I see it less as a sort of a march in one direction than like a cumulative building of these overall things. But I certainly agree with your sort of final overall pattern there. I love your final observation. I think that it seems to be non-coincidental, though what exactly we do with it, I think, is kind of up for grabs a little bit. But it does seem non-coincidental that in the end, Hazel is exactly saved by the same kind of compassion that he shows to others. Indeed, you could even say there's a very close parallel between him saving the mouse from the kestrel and Lucy saving him from the cat, right? In both cases, you have the intervention. I mean, think of even sort of the parallel between what Silver says about the mouse and what Lucy's dad says about Hazel, right? If you just save the rabbits and the place is going to be overrun with rabbits, right? You know, they're more trouble than they're worth. It's going to end up... Right? Both Silver and Lucy's dad say almost exactly the same thing, right? So I love that. I love that observation. And I don't want to just totally diss the progression. I do think it's interesting. We need to think a lot more about what it means to be sort of getting close to the human, and certainly a little bit more about what is so interesting about the fact that whatever, you know, if there's a linear progression or not, nevertheless, the saving of Hazel by Lucy is certainly the capstone, right? It is the culminating moment of this theme, whether there's a linear progression or not. And so therefore your contemplation of the role of humans as the greatest of the Elil, and yet playing this role, you know, the role of Dea in Dea Ex Machina there at the end. The other thing that I think that to me I cannot see these occurrences, you know, this conspiracy, as I've been calling it, it's been going through. I can't see that as a flaw in the narrative. That is to say, I feel like you can enjoy it or not as a theme. You know, you can like it or not. You can think that it's handled interestingly or not interestingly. But what I can't see it is as simply a flaw, just a weakness. The tendency towards Deus Ex Machina, genuine Deus Ex Machina, getting yourself into a narrative bind and then just waving a magic wand to get yourself out of that narrative bind. That's a weakness. But I think that's clearly what is not happening in Watership Down. There are too many for it to be merely a coincidence. And the titling of the chapter, Dea Ex Machina, and really drawing that dynamic to the surface, certainly doesn't seem like a story that is merely accidentally falling into this. So anyway, so no, like I said, I can't see it as a flaw, because a simple weakness in the narrative or sort of lack of ingenuity in the plot. There are times when the kinds of Deus Ex Machina things are examples of that. I can't see that here. I mean, it does seem to be quite a concerted theme over the course of especially the second half of the book. But yeah, Karita says she enjoyed the story partly because it has an interesting take on the idea of providence. Karita, I agree. Again, others perhaps might find it less interesting. But that to me is the question: is how interesting, how stimulating do you find the treatment of providence in this story? Not the debate is for me not about whether or not providence is one of the central themes of the book. I think it pretty clearly is. By the time we get here. Okay. Oh, I would stop early, but we're almost done. Just a couple more minutes. Though I don't think, Mark, I'm going to be able to answer your question satisfactorily. Mark Willie says, Strawberry shows Hazel the mosaic-like image of Elaquera created by a rabbit named Laburnum, and Hazel is baffled by this sight, perhaps not even recognizing it as an image. My question is, what has happened to the rabbits of Cowslip's Warren, and why are they making art? It seems much more than the acceptance of doom from the wire. It almost seems as if they have evolved into something else, something other than rabbits. Do you think this is an example of degeneration rather than evolution? Degeneration in the tradition of medieval philosophic thought, that is, the idea that creatures are declining as time goes on, becoming less and less great, less and less noble. If so, it seems so strange that they would grow in size and stature, gain insight into representational art, develop the ability to laugh, and yet degenerate in courage and moral rabbit artfulness. They make an image of Elaquera while they are losing all the gifts that he had been given in the first myth story. It seems to me to be much worse than a mere deal with the devil. I agree. It is much worse than a deal with the devil. On the one hand, I mean, we talked about this some at the time when we were looking at the second half of book one. Coming back to this issue, and I'm glad you raised it again, Mark, coming back to this issue at the end of the book, to me, the primary thing that I think of that informs my reading of it further is the conversation between Hazel and Fiver at the foot of the Downs, that other world, that where are we really conversation that Hazel and Fiver have. In particular, the references to Silverweed that Fiver makes. Silverweed seems to sort of stand in as, in a sense, almost a symbol of the Warren. It's called Cowslip's Warren, but really it's kind of more like Silverweed's Warren, right? I think that Silverweed is in a sense more typical of that Warren than Cowslip is. Anyway, General Woundwort. We're not permitted to... The story, I think, doesn't permit us to simply dismiss General Woundwort as a complete monster, right? I was talking about earlier on today about the significance of General Woundwort being given not only, not only is he not torn down in his ending, but he's given this sort of mixed legend, right? Well, the Warren of the Snares, I think, is treated similarly. Mark, you make a really good case, I think, though you do it kind of implicitly. You don't state it straight out, but you're sort of implying, essentially, how can all of these things be wrong, right? You seem very understandably, and I think rightly, resistant to the idea that Cowslip's warren is clearly degeneration, right? They have lost the path of rabbitry. They've fallen into something sub-lapine, right? But yet, there are ways in which their actions, their culture, though abnormal, though unnatural, is not obviously hideous or evil or degenerated. Representational art doesn't seem like such a bad thing. The ability to laugh. That's a great point. We didn't talk about that very much when we were discussing that part of the story originally. Now, Cowslip does laugh in mockery, right? Not in companionship. So the quality of his laughter is not real encouraging. But still, it doesn't sound like a bad thing, does it? But again, I think like Woundwort, we can see them going in both directions. And the unnaturalness of the Warren of the Snares, there are elements of that unnaturalness which are good, I think. Remember that Frith sent them strange singers, right? You know, the poetry of Silverweed, or the poetry like Silverweed's, the poetry for which they have abandoned the traditional stories of Elachraira, still nevertheless has its roots in messages from Frith, right? These are still singers that have been sent by Frith and are in touch with the other side, as in touch with the other side as Fiver is. And as Fiver himself says, the line between himself and Silverweed is really subtle. They almost merged together. He just flew wide. Two clouds coming together, and that just don't quite combine. Anyway. I know it's not a really satisfying answer, Mark, but I do think that again, circling back to our initial discussion, one of the things that I think that we can take from it is that it's not enough simply to say the Warren of the Snares is bad and all the ways in which it's unnatural are obviously bad. But rather, again, that distinction between means and ends, right? Doing unnatural things, undertaking practices that are unnatural to rabbits. But what's the end? What's the purpose? What's the function, right? Take, for instance, the similarity that Hazel pointed out, right? That rabbits carrying food is unnatural. Carrying food underground like that is unnatural. But they did it with the Three Arrows lettuce back in the Sandalford Warren, right? What's the difference? The difference is the way the carrying of food that's going on in the Warren of the Snares replaces normal rabbit activity, right? It transforms them from rabbits who must go out to silflay and be cautious and, apply the gifts of Elachraira in the interest of survival. They change from that into creatures who don't even have to leave in order they can eat rich food while safe underground, right? Because they're living on the handouts of men. Whereas again, the Three Arrows lettuce, that's not the goal. The end that's in mind with the carrying of the Three Arrows lettuce back to the Warren, it's to honor the chief rabbit, to serve the chief rabbit, who is himself getting aged, though still not weak, and certainly still wise. That seems like not if anything, that choice to do the thing which is unnatural, that is to drag Flayra back to the Threera and not just to eat it yourself on the spot during your garden raid, seems to be a sort of a step forward. It makes you better rabbits, right? So, as we've seen in Watership Down, the doing of unnatural things is itself a good thing, not necessarily a bad thing. Okay, final question. Is Watership Down a children's book? Nancy says, I've often seen it classified as a children's book, but it seems to me that it would take a very ambitious child to tackle the book. It's not just because of the amount of horror that's in it, although I did enjoy the recent interview with Adams about that, but it seems to be quite long, very serious, and complex. I had begun to think that it got classed with children's books mostly because it had animals as characters, though as you point out, it's very different from most stories about animals. But then I know that it began from stories Adams told his children in the car, and you said that you read it as a child, so I guess I also wondered if you'd have something interesting to say about that as someone who read it as a child yourself. Yes, I did read it as a child. I read and this was not even read to me by my parents. I actually did read this silently on my own, though it was given to me by my dad. And that was very special because my dad doesn't read fiction. It is one of the very few fiction works that he doesn't. In fact, come to think of it, I can't think of another single work of fiction my father has ever recommended to me in my life to date. So there was something kind of special about it. Like, Dad said this was a good book. So if I did struggle with it, I don't remember struggling with it a lot the first time. But I certainly had sort of the motivation to push through, much stronger than I would have had I just picked it up off a shelf in a library. But as far as the horror elements, I disagree that there are horror elements. There's danger, and Woundwort is kind of terrifying, but he's not terrifying in the way that, like, monsters in horror movies or like Stephen King books are terrifying. I never, ever was scared while reading Watership Down. I remember as a child loving it as a heroic adventure story. Doubtless I missed a very great deal. Apparently, to the present day, I missed the reference to Dr. Adams. But I never found it really scary. Karita was just saying the same thing. She didn't find it too dark or scary as a child. But yeah, sure, there are lots of things that I have grown into and come to appreciate more. Like I kind of felt that Hazel was awesome, but I didn't exactly know why. I couldn't have exactly explained why. I could have explained why Bigwig was awesome, and I always loved him more as a child. In fact, I think that Watership Down had a really profound effect on my imagination back in those days. My mother probably still has that copy of the first creative writing I ever did as a child at the age of 8, right around the same time here, this same year. I read The Hobbit and Watership Down in that year and was given a typewriter for Christmas. These three things all came together to make me for many years want to be a writer. And the very first story I ever wrote was a story which featured animals fighting with each other in climactic battles, like Woundwort and Bigwig. It was a bear hero was my story. And no, it has nothing to do with Shardik, which I didn't read until much later, and didn't really like at all. Though I'm willing to give it another shot now. I was in high school, I think. Yeah, and I was definitely in high school when I read it. But anyway, so like, and I read it with my son. He was a little bit older, maybe 9 or 10 when I read it with him. But yeah, if I'm very unlucky, my mom still has a copy of that story. If ever I need a strong dose of mortification, perhaps that will someday be released. No, I'm not going to show it to you. I don't have it, and I don't want to know exactly where it is. But if I remember correctly, the loser in the great fight between the bear and the rival bear who was fighting against him, I think the loser ended up getting thrown off a cliff. I think. I think that's. I'm pretty sure that's what happened there in the end. Anyway, enough about that. Nancy, I do think Watership Down is generally classified as a children's book because it's about animals. I mean, and this seems to me just a part of the general pathology, which Tolkien points to so eloquently in On Fairy Stories. The fact that anything fantastical, and whatever else whatever genre else it may be, Watership Down is fantasy. It's fantasy in a pure sense. Not fantasy in the sense that it depicts magic. Of course, there isn't magic. There might be miracle and there's providence, but again, there's a lot of that going around in many kinds of story. It's in its way quite a mundane story, compared to most works that people would call fantasy. But it is clearly fantasy in the far purer sense of inviting us to invest in a secondary world which is not the same as our primary world, of stepping outside our own experience. And certainly the qualities of fantasy that in his essay on on fairy stories Tolkien attributes to fantasy, those clearly are evidenced in Watership Down. And basically anything vaguely in that genre. I mean, it seems that with only a few exceptions, almost every kind of story which is not sort of boring, natural... Oh, excuse me, did I say that aloud? I meant mundane, naturalistic fiction. And anything else is basically classified as sort of being for children because it's sort of safer. And I will say, if there is one thing for which I admire for which I think J.K. Rowling accomplished in the Harry Potter novels, it was to make it cool. You could say, well, Tolkien already did that. No, Tolkien didn't. Tolkien created a large subculture, right? But 20 years ago, you still, well, in fact, indeed to this day, you're still considered a geek, and in some sense somewhat countercultural if you're a major Tolkien fan. But during the Harry Potter phenomenon, while the books were being released, everyone was reading them, and it was normal. Nobody made excuses about it. And that was actually, to me, one of the most fascinating things about the Harry Potter phenomenon, and one of the things for which I give J.K. Rowling a great deal of credit. Yes, Thomas, many people do dismiss Harry Potter as children's literature, but they still read it. And by and large, without blushing. So anyway, that I think is... and I don't need to, get deep into the history there, but so Nancy, to me, that's really the only justification. It is certainly not, if it is certainly not a book which is written manifestly to appeal to children, or sort of targeted towards children in the way that The Hobbit is, or the Chronicles of Narnia are. I mean, the narrators of those works, or even more plainly, the wonderful book, The Marvelous Land of Snurgs, which was an inspiration of Tolkien's, Alice in Wonderland, Winnie the Pooh. All of these books have very active narrative voices, which are either explicitly targeting children. That is, like, I'm thinking, of course, here of Winnie the Pooh, whose narrator is a father reading the story to his son, right, Christopher Robin. Sometimes that's quite explicit. Sometimes that's included in a framing mechanism, as in Alice in Wonderland, where you get the introductory materials, which is Lewis Carroll speaking to his, the little girl to whom he's dedicating it. Anyway, all these things are so to me, if you want to talk about something that is children's literature, a work of literature which is explicitly directed to children, like, okay, I'm ready to call that a children's book. Calling something a children's book simply because it undertakes something which most modern adults aren't comfortable with, I'm not really okay with that. I would say, however, I mean, it's not like I think that it's not like I'd recommend tossing Watership Down to, any 7-year-old. Like I said, I was particularly motivated. I don't know, maybe I wouldn't have made it through if it hadn't been for my motivations. Yeah, Karita, I agree. That's a C.S. Lewis dictum, right? That good children's books ought to be suitable for adults, and bad children's books are suitable for none. Yeah. I mean, I certainly agree with that concept. But no. Again, I wouldn't characterize Watership Down as a children's book in general. But I don't at all think it's inappropriate for children. Oh yeah, Karita, you hadn't read that? Yeah, no. I'm trying to remember how Lewis said it. He said it kind of the other way around. He said, any children's book which is not worth rereading as an adult was never worth reading at all. Something like that. I can't remember exactly where he says it. I can't remember which essay it comes in. But anyway. On stories, Thomas, maybe on stories. It's one of the works in that volume. I'm like craning my eyes over to my bookshelf over here. Anyway, well, that concludes finally our discussion of Watership Down. We're going to come back and talk about the movie next time. So your assignment, if you can steel yourself to it, is to watch the film. I've been quite open about the fact that I strongly dislike this film. And I'm going to be very interested to try to figure out why I dislike this film. So I'll be interested to talk about that next time. If you've never seen it, well, you have an assignment between now and next week to find and watch the Watership Down film. And we'll talk about that adaptation next time. No, I never did, Yana, see the TV version. I haven't seen that at all. All I've seen is the animated feature that was released. Yana says it's very different and a lot better. Yeah, we'll see. Brian Yoder says, I read the book, then watched the film, and felt deeply offended and couldn't really articulate why. I had almost the exact same experience, Brian. So let's get back to it. So anyway, next time we'll talk about that, and I will finally let you guys go. Thank you for your patience, Yana. It's time for you to start your day over there, and I appreciate your time. I've had so much fun going through Watership Down with you guys, and I look forward to our next book, which is not determined, by the way. The election is still not complete for our next book. So maybe by next week, when we have our last Watership Down class, I will be able to announce what the subject of our next class is going to be. So more on that next time, and I will see you guys next week, next Wednesday, for our last class on the movie. Thanks, everybody. Good night.